that's part of the reason why I wanted to start this podcast and this show was to really get true information from industry professionals to the artist directly so they don't make some of these mistakes. And going back, what was that term you just said? Because it was incredible. It was what something forensics. What was it?
Oh, yeah. Maddie does. She calls it Spotify forensics.
Yeah, I'm over here taking notes because I think a lot of the things you're saying are gold. Yeah, and I don't know if you're like me, but on the industry side, if we're approached by an artist to do a PR campaign or whatever we're going to do, we're going to go and look at those Spotify the public data on Spotify on their page that we can see, and if we see that, let's say they're a country artist, but the majority of their listeners are coming from Brazil, then it's kind of like, oh, well, we know what's going on. And is that something that is that a vetting thing that you guys are doing on your end when you consider doing a distribution deal with an act?
Yeah, I mean, I think that geographic data is really important, in understanding consumption patterns. I think also if you're looking at the artist Spotify conversion rate, which is that follower count to monthly listener ratio, that will show you a solid example of the amount of fans that have converted and selecting to actively follow, that active data point relative to the amount of people that have listened in the last 29 days. So it's a solid indicator that Spotify looks at of that retention and kind of owning your fan base and continuing to target those fans.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. I'm excited to have Robey on, who is the head of distribution at KMG Distribution. We've worked together over the years and share some mutual clients, some mutual artists, and I'm really excited to kind of break down the world of distribution for everybody to get kind of an insight on what's going on there and how we can best position ourselves to make the most out of it. So Ross, welcome on.
Great to be with you, Mike. We have a great working relationship, and I know we see eye to eye on a lot of the moving parts in this quote unquote dynamic independent space. So always love to chop it up with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I got a list here of some of the diverse roster that you've signed on and worked with over at KMG. So let me rattle off some. All That Remains, Lonestar, T.I., and Nick Carter of the Backstreet Boys. And this list goes on, but that's just a few. And with all that kind of talent funneling through, what's your day-to-day looking like?
Yeah. I think it really runs the gamut, depending on what in any given month we have kind of in the pipeline as far as release schedule. But my day can be anything from fielding submissions, whether artist or label submissions, to actually, fielding requests, support. But yeah, we find it, we sign it, and then we work those catalogs. And the biggest thing for us is that we're signing discriminatingly enough so that we have that time equity to be able to offer, a level of service, a level of white glove care that will hopefully make us, continue to be competitive in a marketplace with so many players and so many platforms, and bringing the service back to distribution as opposed to it just being a product where at scale, I think some of the service is sacrificed.
I mean, speaking of the white glove care that you guys kind of, offer to your artists who team up with you, oftentimes, when we start working with clients on a new project, they'll ask, well, I'll ask them actually. I'll go, who are you using for distribution? Because I kind of want to know where they're at. And, oftentimes they say, well, we're just going to use TuneCore or DistroKid and kind of upload it that way, which is great, fine if you want to go that route. I'm the believer that you kind of want to have as many champions in your corner as possible. And so on the distro side, I feel that it's super important that you have, somebody who is going to pick up the phone, answer an email, work with you, strategize with you, and make the most out of, what's being offered. So kind of like along that line of thinking, what are some of the different types of distribution deals that are happening right now?
Yeah, I think the types of deals are mostly leveraged against what services are being provided. We try to make everything inclusive, and it's a standard commission where we put the music out, the DSPs pay out the revenues to us, and then we pay out 100% of earnings less our distribution fee to the artist or label client. So again, it's a commission based, only against the products that we have delivered over the course of the term for anywhere from a 1 year, 3 year, whatever is negotiated as the term of that particular catalog or release license.
Mhm. So what's most common that you're seeing, funneling through KMG? Is it more of those long-term relationships or more of like 1 year, like we're just going to focus on this project, or is it more of like catalog in 3 years? What are you guys kind of seeing?
Yeah, I mean, we try to be flexible as far as the exploitation period, quote unquote, where we're delivering and monetizing those releases. The term of that is subject to the release date. So, let's say an artist brings an EP to us on day one, and then a year later another release. The monetization period is different between the two releases, so that the artist isn't tied down across their whole catalog for the same period of time. And hopefully that builds enough good faith, and we're working hard and building a relationship and a rapport and success where regardless the artist is going to keep bringing new products to us, and that exploitation period and the work and the monetization just continues.
Yeah, and with you guys at KMG, are you guys focusing just mainly on DSPs and streaming, or are you guys handling some physical products for certain acts as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think while our specialization is in digital, we know what we do well. There are products that do require physical, and through some of our partners, we're able to activate that. So for example, the All That Remains release, we're working the vinyl on that. And the reason that's incredibly beneficial is because if you're aligning digital and physical strategy, when it comes to things like Spotify Fans First or incentivizing purchases with driving digital, consumption, having the two strategies work hand in hand, I think can be incredibly beneficial.
I've been reading like a lot of mixed reports in the sense of like maybe CDs had a spike in 2024. I think I read that compared to previous years. Are you seeing anything with CDs, or I mean, even cassettes were having a moment? Are you seeing anything like that, or is it kind of just novelty and falling away pretty quickly?
We kind of approach that looking less at macro consumer behavior and more genre specific. I think metal fans still buy CDs. All That Remains, we're definitely pressing CDs, especially for when the vinyl sells out. It's really up to understanding your audience behavior, particular to that genre, or particular to that audience. Yeah, for sure.
How do you find some of those data markers in terms of like, okay, is the audience of X band, do they have CD players? Like, how do you figure that out? Because I know for me, like when I bought my Jeep in 2016, no CD player, so that was like a game changer. So are you guys looking at like what are people driving in that audience, or
I think it's interesting because we have more data than ever at our fingertips. And while not directly answering that question, in analyzing the digital side, our analytics will tell us, what piece of technology was streaming the product, how much was mobile, how much was desktop, how much, et cetera. And so, reviewing sales figures, of course. But with a band like All That Remains, it proved to be challenging because they had not released a record in I think 13 years. So, looking, of course, at Luminate data and looking at other patterns and making certain inferences, I think, is the big challenge. And when people run projections, there are a million ways to do it. But I think a lot of it, can't be an algorithm. A lot of it needs to be, human decision making.
Yeah. And so let's say there's an artist out there and they've never pressed vinyl on a release. What are some hurdles that they should be aware of and mindful of if they're going to go down that road and try to tie in some physical vinyl with their new album?
Sure. I think access is the biggest thing is with digital, lead times have been reduced and reduced. Lead times are required to get a record live. We can get a record live across services in a day if need be. Whereas vinyl lead times, depending on the manufacturer, and the relationship and how, you know, much you can pull the relationship and pull favors in getting things fast tracked, there are a lot of considerations with lead time. So in having that, especially if you are aligning the digital and physical strategy, it's important to get out in front of that.
And I think Bandcamp, are they pressing vinyl? Do you know anything about that?
They have that program now. Yeah, for sure. We're not as involved with Bandcamp. We kind of rely on our artist and label clientele to manage their own Bandcamp just because that's the D2C model. They pay direct. So we do allow we carve that out of our rights that we license.
Got it. What are you seeing in terms of, your acts that are releasing vinyl product? And I'm thinking it through the lens of a DIY artist who wants to do vinyl. It's an expensive cost, right? To press, whether it's 500 units, 1,000 units, or higher, it's going to set you back. It's going to cost some money. Are you seeing pre-orders being a way to navigate that?
Yes and no. I think that if you're launching that long lead with regard to pre-orders, it almost becomes that cliche of an announcement of an announcement, and then fans are left waiting many months before the product comes out because of production lead times. So I do think there is certain risk involved, like you said, but there is definitely benefit to staggering, maybe doing a pre-order of 250 units, and then when that sells up, another 250, or having your partnerships align based on watching the demand as it occurs, again with the caveat that you need to consider production lead times.
Right, that makes sense. Let's talk about kind of best practices going into the new year of 2025. What are you seeing as ways to optimize the releases? Whether that, if you want to talk physical or if you want to talk digital streaming.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few just bare bones distribution 101 checklist items that we give to clientele in preparing for a release, so that we know that they're doing everything in their power to leverage the tools on DSPs. Those are things like make sure all your banners are updated, make sure your bios are updated, make sure your links are there and everything is optimized on your link tree. Make sure your link tree is pixeled so that you're owning your fan data. But that's just to name a few things that in preparing, not only will that increase, we speculate that will increase their SEO, but also these are the little things that are in their control to continue to optimize a release.
Yeah, and let's talk about pre-saves. It was a major thing. I feel like everybody was doing pre-saves. Are pre-saves still important in terms of campaign rollout and kind of front loading release day?
It's so interesting to me that that's something that people have such strong opinions one way or another on. I think it's important to recognize the benefit if you do a pre-save, and that's quote unquote owning your audience is I think kind of the buzz phrase that you're hearing now. If you're pixeling the pre-save, you're able to collect fan data, emails to then retarget. When I say retarget, I mean as you're approaching digital advertising campaigns, you are more narrowly targeting according to the data that you're collecting.
Are you talking about through social platforms, retargeting that way?
Yeah, social platforms. Yep. And even on DSPs, if you're doing media buys on DSPs. And so, owning your data, understanding your audience data, and then also retargeting those fans that have pre-saved, so that even if you don't necessarily believe in the efficacy of a pre-save itself, you're taking advantage of owning your audience.
That makes complete sense. That's a great tip. And because also attention spans, you might pre-save it 4 weeks from release and then totally forget about it. Everything gets lost in the flood of the noise of like 100,000 releases a day on Spotify or whatever the stat is now. Is that the stat still?
I mean, I at one point was hearing it's over 200,000. I hear different things.
That's crazy. And are there tools out there that artists can be utilizing in terms of pre-saves? Because I feel like the hardest thing I ever come across with pre-saves as a consumer is that if I click pre-save on whatever link the artist might put up, if I'm not logged into my Spotify account, I'm like, I don't know what my password is, and then it's like, forget it. So are there any tools that kind of help optimize pre-saves?
Yeah, it's funny that you say logging into Spotify for artists, and I'm kind of contradicting my last point here, but since they launched their native pre-save, you can launch countdown campaigns for record releases. They provide comprehensive data on those pre-saves, trends more so than individual audience data, but it's really interesting to watch that as it's on platform be more effective than, pushing some transactional call to action on social media where you don't know whether or not your fans are actually going to engage with it, as opposed to seeing it on platform on your artist page, where it's front and center, where you're consuming the music and having people. So we've seen a couple of those really be effective. But yeah, and to answer your question about external, off-platform pre-saves, pixel data, I think a lot of people like, incorporating their domain so that it's all aligned with their brand. And yeah, I mean, it's the different pre-saves, whether Foundy or Toned In, have different bells and whistles. It's just, whatever you want to apply to your campaign. Some of them have an evergreen pre-save, which it's a lifetime pre-save where essentially the fan is opting in to have all future releases then saved to the library, which is pretty cool.
That's cool, especially if you're like me and there's so much music that you like, and then you forget that you like that music, or that new artist that you just discovered. And then you're listening to the album, for 3 months, 4 months, and then, I've listened to it. And then you forgot about the artist just because there's so much going on. So that's actually a great little tip right there.
Yeah. And hopefully that doesn't have a U2 on an iPod level backlash to where, fans are seeing things in their library that they weren't aware that they necessarily opted into. But I do think in a world, like you said, with so much content and, hundreds of thousands of new songs a week, retention is everything, and holding on to that audience and continuing to snowball things. So, perhaps it is an effective tool.
Yeah. What about Feature FM? Is that a good tool? That's one that I recommend to a lot of my clients.
Yeah, I mean, Feature FM has its own bells and whistles. I haven't used Feature FM in a couple of years, admittedly, because we've been using Foundy. But, certainly it has its, I think you can also generate preview links with Feature FM. And I do think you can incorporate those previews, both audio and video, if I'm not mistaken, at the top of the pre-save, so that it's more of one of those new platforms that it's a one-stop shop that integrates everything.
Yeah. Well, I think the hardest thing about the music industry specifically is, besides finding attention and then holding on to it, building a fan base and keeping those fans, is constantly having to learn new ways of kind of using these tools, like the countdown thing that you were talking about, which is cool. And I've seen a couple artists doing it. When that came out like a few months ago, right? I feel like for Spotify, the countdown thing.
It was kind of invite only at one point, as Spotify rolls out certain features, sometimes they'll do invite only, or they'll only release, a feature to a select group of artists, and then they roll it out to the public. But yeah, now it's rolled out to Spotify for artists.
Yeah, I'm curious of like what the best way to use that tool is, because the ones that I saw, maybe two or three artists that I saw using it, basically, if it was a 15 track album, pretty much the whole album was almost available by the time release date came. It was kind of like they were just trickling tracks out, week after week almost, or something like that. So it's kind of interesting. I'm curious to kind of watch how that unfolds and how people kind of optimize it.
Yeah, I mean, and that also kind of brings up a strategy that has is done so frequently now that it's been labeled as cliche, but the idea of waterfalling, where you release single A, and then when you release single B, single A is attached to it, and so on and so forth until you have a body of work. Our experience of the countdown page is that it is very much like the old days of an iTunes pre-order, where the products that aren't released are grayed out, or excuse me, the assets are grayed out across that product, but those that are released can still be played on that product page that you're pre-saving, which kind of ties it all together. But you're right, it definitely makes the prior tracks accessible in the context of the release.
And you touched on iTunes. Let's talk about iTunes for a second and downloads. How important, and I guess it comes down to the audience of each respective artist and how they consume their music. But if you were to just average it out across the board of all the different artists you work with at all the different levels and different genres, how important is iTunes as part of their distribution plan for single downloads, album downloads, and all that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I agree that a lot of people believe, the purchase model is antiquated, and in most cases it is. I do think there are niche audiences like, we did a release by the late Lyle Mays, who's a jazz legend. He was a founder of the Pat Metheny Group. Many, many Grammys won by him, and his audience are, an older demographic, and still very much do make purchases. And so we did find that a good amount of his share of big share of his consumption was in purchases. And so I do think that in most cases that's an exception to the rule, especially because, Apple Music has been phasing out iTunes for a while now, where all iTunes links automatically redirect to Apple Music links anyway. So, but yeah, I think there are niches where it is important.
Now, does this fall into your world, or is this more marketing? Like, we're still talking about iTunes. When you become like a featured pre-order on iTunes, you know what I'm talking about?
So iTunes, well, Apple Music does have, front page features, and, you'll see new song releases by genre where they are featured, where in addition to their editorial programming, their playlisting, they also do have, featured listings across front pages and genre pages. So yeah, absolutely.
Is that more distribution influence, or is that more of a marketing maneuver?
That is something that is pitched along with pitching editorial.
Got it. Okay, well let's move into something that everybody wants to talk about these days, and that's playlisting. Now, I get a lot of artists that we work with who they want to seek out these third party companies that kind of promise that they're going to pitch them to playlist, and they'll even guarantee like X amount of placements on these playlists. And from my point of view, is that a lot of these companies, I won't name names, but they're placing artists on these random playlists that are kind of run by bots in other countries, and then they get flagged by Spotify, and then it kind of like shrinks their reach organically on the platform. What's kind of your experience in third-party playlisting?
So we encourage our clientele to avoid third-party playlisting campaigns always, because you can never be absolutely certain that a third-party playlist or a civilian playlist is utilizing 100% organic streaming. And if they're charging for an exact number of streams, then they're incentivized to be botting anyway. So it's much, it's a shortcut that will 9 times out of 10 only screw the artist. Not only, in the event that you mentioned that Spotify is flagging artificial content and or taking it down, but it's also algorithmically positioning an artist in a way that will cost many thousands of dollars to be able to reposition. This is actually something that my friend Maddie at Shark Attack has a lot of clients that she does this for, Spotify Forensics, where she analyzes an artist's positioning algorithmically. And if it's wrong, because they've done things like third-party playlisting where, their fans also listen to artists are not at all what they should be sonically, then it's going to cost tens of thousands of dollars in a concerted advertising campaign to reposition and start targeting a proper audience. So not only is it putting your music at risk, but it's also putting your career at risk by positioning you incorrectly and by engaging in things that you can't be certain are on the up and up. And there are often times where, an artist is doing this in good faith, just not knowing that, just naively engaging in these things. And
that's part of the reason why I wanted to start this podcast and this show, was to really get true information from industry professionals to the artist directly so they don't make some of these mistakes. And going back, what was that term you just said? Because it was incredible. It was something forensics. What was it?
Oh, yeah. Maddie does, she calls it Spotify Forensics.
Yeah, I'm over here taking notes because I think a lot of the things you're saying are gold. Yeah, and I don't know if you're like me, but on the industry side, if we're approached by an artist to do a PR campaign or whatever we're going to do, we're going to go and look at those Spotify the public data on Spotify on their page that we can see, and if we see that, let's say they're a country artist, but the majority of their listeners are coming from Brazil, then it's kind of like, oh, well, we know what's going on. And is that something that is that a vetting thing that you guys are doing on your end when you consider doing a distribution deal with an act?
Yeah, I mean, I think that geographic data is really important, in understanding consumption patterns. I think also if you're looking at the artist Spotify conversion rate, which is that follower count to monthly listener ratio, that will show you a solid example of the amount of fans that have converted and selecting to actively follow, that active data point relative to the amount of people that have listened in the last 29 days. So it's a solid indicator that Spotify looks at of that retention and kind of owning your fan base and continuing to target those fans.
Yeah. So artists out there, you want to get on official playlists, and let's walk through some best practices to get on official playlists. I know a lot of the times that comes straight from folks just like yourself who are on your side with distro, and you're doing personal outreaches, right? Along with other submission processes for each platform. Let's talk a little bit about how an act can increase their chances this year with landing some placements on some legit playlists.
Yeah, I mean, what we tell our clients is that playlisting is not a marketing plan. It is the reward for the success, the efficacy of the marketing plan. So, Spotify, the DSPs, they're largely data companies. And how are you showing proof of concept to those companies that you're driving traffic to their platform? Because that's their interest, and understandably so. And so, if we're able to show these different things in the marketing mix that are driving that traffic, and we have that proof of concept, then the reward is the playlisting.
That makes a lot of sense. And what are some aspects of the marketing plan that you think incentivize or can showcase that to the platforms?
Yeah, I think, anything that deals with owning your audience, I think, showing a concerted effort at retargeting ad campaigns, especially, at, I know platforms like when you're doing media buys that are on platform, but also from your socials, showing that you have retention. It's one thing if you have 1 million followers on Facebook, it's another thing if any of them are actually converting to Spotify. Because we've seen, time and time again with veteran artists that have these massive social followings, but, the key is making sure that they're retaining that fan base and actually consuming the music. And so, things like that. I know that you and your guys do a great job at telling a story, but I think the most important thing is that the story is there so that you can tell that story. I'm sure you agree, PR like playlisting is a tool to be able to communicate those things that are actually already happening, right? So owning your fan base, making sure that you're nurturing that fan base on your socials, and doing all of those things that are in your power, then that great write-up, that great playlist, all of those things that then serve to reinforce that will follow.
So if I've been listening correctly to all the advice you've been given here, so let's go back to the retargeting thing. So maybe a good strategy would be, and I'll have one more final question before we wrap it up, but let's say their strategy right now is we're going to put out an EP, and maybe let's just say there's 2 single song releases ahead of that full EP coming out. So you're saying like single one, maybe we're pre-saved campaign, things like that, but we're using Pixel and we're collecting all that data. And then what we're doing is single number 2, we're going to retarget all those folks. And then would we want to direct them straight to Spotify on release day, or kind of what would your suggestion be once we run the first single, we collect the data, and then how do we retarget and where are we directing them?
Yeah, I think that's the answer to that is understanding where the audience lives and what patterns they consume music. I think if the largest share of listenership you have is, on Amazon, then, you can nurture that. And if the strategy is to retarget accordingly, then you can do that. Or, let's say you want to build your presence, on YouTube, you want to build your presence, on other platforms. It's really just a matter of what the goals of the campaign are.
Yeah. And kind of on that lens, let's talk about like there's Spotify for artists, there's Apple Music for artists, there's probably Amazon Music for artists, and there's probably Pandora Music for artists. They all have these kind of entryways and portals to go into. Is that something that you guys tap into on your end, or is that strictly for the artists, and should they actively be utilizing that?
So we as the distributor can put through those pitches, but we do advise the artists how to claim their profiles and then how to maximize all those tools. Like my buddy Andy at Pandora runs the AMP program, which is their Spotify for artists for Pandora. And they have great tools on platform. They have audio tags. They have, free campaigns where you can feature a track and it boosts the track's visibility, tons. So I think, engaging with those tools that are free, which of course we do advise on, best practices, are things that are in the artist's control, are very easy to do, very, don't take a lot of time, and I think are very effective. So yeah, we encourage artists to engage with all of their profiles, make sure everything is optimized, make sure the branding is consistent across all, in preparing for those releases and taking advantage.
Cool, man. I really appreciate you carving time out of your day to chat with me and get some of this information out there. Let me hit you with a final question. Let's say we were to sum up this entire conversation into a really great social media clip. What would be what are the three most important things you think an artist needs to be thinking about to optimize their release next year?
Yeah, I think the idea that distribution is both a product and a service. And I think what you need out of that service, every distributor provides, different things. It's just a matter of understanding your needs in this independent, free-for-all craziness of a music space and finding that partner that can fulfill those exact needs. And then from there, it's cliche and it's kind of been the buzz topic at every panel ever right now, but it's true. Owning your audience, understanding those consumption patterns so that you can then nurture that audience.
That's great. Well, listen, I hope a lot of artists are listening to this and they realize that maybe they need some real life people being a champion on the distribution side. And I would advise people to go to KMG Distribution and reach out to Ross.
Awesome, Mike. Yeah, man, I know we work on some great projects and can't wait to for 2025 that's more great products together and really value you guys and your time.
Absolutely. Likewise, buddy.
All right, man. Thanks a lot.